Now, just to give you an idea for why Angkor Wat is viewed as such a symbol for Cambodia, I mean, the temple appears on the Cambodian flag. The reason it's viewed as such a high point is because Angkor Wat is probably one of the most beautiful and sophisticated monuments, religious buildings in the world at the time it was created. So it was made in the 13 and 1400s. It is truly massive. Picture here doesn't really do it justice. You can have a look on Google Earth if you're curious. And it's surrounded by a moat, which was man-made. There's a complex irrigation system in here, and whole parts of Angkor Wat are filled with beautiful bas reliefs, carvings, that kind of thing. When Europeans came to Cambodia and saw Angkor Wat, particularly in the case of the French in, I think, the 17th century, they actually could not believe that the people who lived in Cambodia at the time had created such a beautiful building. So some French archaeologists actually theorized that there must have been some kind of missing ancient culture. Looking at Angkor Wat, they thought it was created at the same time that the Romans had created amphitheaters. And they thought there was some very complex, sophisticated ancient culture in Cambodia that was now lost. It took them quite a while to recognize that the people living on the land, that their ancestors had created that monument, but that is how beautiful and complex it is. All right, on to Vietnam. So obviously the people of Vietnam are called Vietnamese. For a little bit of backstory, context on Vietnam, it is incredibly fertile land, some of the most fertile land in the world, particularly for rice paddies. It is also one of the most heavily populated areas in Southeast Asia. At the turn of the century, the 20th century, it had a much larger population than Cambodia. And due to its geographic region, just south of China, it is continually facing incursions by China. Sometimes it's a tributary of certain dynasties of China, so the Ming might invade and make it a tributary state. Sometimes it's just entirely invaded and integrated into China. This is a continuing theme for hundreds and hundreds of years, and there's a lot of animosity and rebellions towards Chinese rule. There are some instances of this which would take way too long to go into, but for example, the Trung sisters, two sisters in Vietnam, fought off Chinese rule. And even once the Chinese are fought off for a period of time, little states emerge. Vietnam is not, well, it is rarely fully unified. It's either invaded by China or a tributary of China, or there are different little states which emerge which are not aligned and unified. There are a number of civil wars in the 16 and 1700s to reunite the country, to draw these fragmented states together, particularly among the Trin and Nguyen families. European nations often fund different sides. They supply them with firearms and they make the wars really destructive. They have a really destabilizing influence. And these civil wars aren't really resolved until the early 1800s, when the Nguyen dynasty wins. However, it should be noted that just because this dynasty wins and partially unites parts of Vietnam doesn't mean that Vietnam was an independent and free nation from 1802. It was more of a puppet state of the French. The French had a lot of influence on the Nguyen dynasty and a lot of power. All right, so just to give you a bit of background for France's involvement in the area. France, throughout the last several hundred years, throughout the 1700s and 1800s, had really expanded its territories. Under Napoleon, France had conquered a lot of continental Europe, and particularly in the last half of the 1800s, France had been looking for territories overseas. A lot of these were in North Africa, but they also cast their eye towards many countries in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, because these countries were really resource rich. So in the 17th century, missionaries, so priests and religious figures, had explored the area of Cambodia and Vietnam and Thailand, had attempted to spread Christianity or Catholicism. And there were also a lot of French explorers in the region who had visited some of the cultural sites, made notes on the people, and a lot of this information was sent home and published in France. You also had a lot of traders who would trade for spice, rice, jade, that kind of thing, and send it home to France. However, in the 1700s, France didn't really control the region. They had influence and they had roots within these areas, but they didn't have formal control of any of these areas. Over the last couple of hundred years of the 1700s and beginning in the 1800s though, they really started coveting the wealth of some of these countries, and they explicitly sought to increase their influence in these regions. So in the early 1800s, as I mentioned before, France started supplying some weapons to some leaders in Vietnam and backing explicit sides. They also sent more and more missionaries because they really hoped to spread Catholicism throughout the entire region. However, that level of influence wasn't really enough for France, and they started to desire more and more power. So in 1887, they seized control of the entire region here and created what is known as French Indochina. So French Indochina included what is now Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, which they divided into 3 separate states. Tonkin, which is northern Vietnam, Annam, which is the central part, and Cochin China, which is the south of Vietnam. This colony was established explicitly as a source of revenue for France. They got a lot of wealth from these areas. They obtained lots of material like rice and jade and other things like that, and they imposed really high taxes on the people living in these areas, which brought in a lot of wealth for the French there. However, it should be noted that the people of these areas didn't take this seizure of power very kindly, and France's conquest of French Indochina was never stable, and often there were lots of uprisings and rebellions in this area which tried to fight off French rule. This was especially the case in Vietnam, particularly the northern parts of Vietnam, where the people there really resented French rule and French power. We'll be going more into detail about French Indochina in the next lesson, but that's a little bit of an introduction for you. Alright, on to the last part. All of our content is done now. You will have 3 questions posted on Google Classroom, and there'll be a Google form, which will just say quiz or Monday's quiz or something like that. I want you to work on these questions, and once you've done that, you've completed the lesson. A couple of these questions will be multiple choice. You'll have several options. You just have to select the correct answer. One of them will be short answer, where you have to type in what the answer is. I'll be doing these after a lot of lessons just to make sure that you've followed the content and that you've got the key points. If you have any problems doing the quiz or if you didn't understand anything in here, just either flick me an email or make a post in Google Classroom. So that's the lesson done for now. Finish the quiz and make sure you log on by 9 AM Wednesday to follow on with the next part of our content.